Hey guys, tonight we begin with how people in ancient Egypt had sex, and trust me, it's going to shatter every assumption you've ever had about the ancient world. These weren't prudish, repressed people hiding behind religious shame. They were the most sexually liberated civilization in human history, where gods masturbated universes into existence and pharaohs ritually pleasured themselves into the Nile. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception about ancient Egyptian sexuality. Most people imagine these folks as sexually repressed prudes, wrapped up in religious taboos and social restrictions, like every other ancient civilization we've studied. In reality, ancient Egyptians were basically running the world's first free love commune for 3,000 years straight. Think of it like this: if ancient Greece was that uptight friend who judges your dating choices, and Rome was the aggressive frat bro who turns everything sexual into a power play, then Egypt was the chill hippie who genuinely believed love and sex were sacred gifts from the gods to be enjoyed by everyone. This wasn't some idealistic paradise where everyone held hands and sang kumbaya. It was a realistic, often messy civilization where women could divorce their husbands for being bad in bed, where contraception recipes were basically ancient Planned Parenthood pamphlets, and where the gods themselves provided detailed instructions on proper sexual technique. To be fair, this shouldn't be entirely surprising when you consider that their creation myth literally begins with the universe being masturbated into existence. But somehow, centuries of Victorian scholars managed to sanitize and hide the most sexually progressive civilization in human history, probably because they were too scandalized to admit that ancient people might have actually enjoyed sex more than they did. Ancient Egypt from roughly 3100 BCE to 30 BCE was unlike anything we typically associate with the ancient world. The Nile Valley wasn't some backwards desert kingdom where women were property and sex was shameful. It was the longest running, most stable civilization in human history, where gender equality was so normal they didn't even have a word for virgin, because nobody cared about sexual experience before marriage. The pharaohs controlled not just political power, but religious authority, and since the gods were openly sexual beings, this created a culture where sexuality was literally sacred rather than sinful. If you thought ancient civilizations were all about patriarchal control and sexual repression, think again. Egyptian women could own property independently, initiate divorce whenever they wanted, live alone without male guardians, negotiate their own marriage contracts, and basically tell any man to take a long walk off a short pyramid if he didn't treat them right. Meanwhile, their male counterparts were required by law to financially support ex-wives and couldn't remarry without settling previous obligations. The timeline here is staggering. We're talking about sexual attitudes that remained consistently progressive across 3 millennia, surviving conquest by Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Arabs. While other civilizations rose and fell around them, Egyptians maintained their liberal approach to love, sex, and relationships with remarkable consistency. The Old Kingdom pharaohs were building pyramids and celebrating fertility festivals. The Middle Kingdom was writing love poetry that sounds like modern pop songs, and the New Kingdom was mass-producing contraceptive manuals and erotic art. Through it all, the basic Egyptian attitude remained: sex is natural, pleasure is good, women are equal partners, and the gods approve. Let me introduce you to Hatshepsut, one of history's most successful pharaohs, who ruled Egypt for 22 years during the 15th century BCE. Now, Hatshepsut is famous for being a female pharaoh who wore a fake beard and built magnificent temples. But what's really fascinating is how her reign demonstrates Egyptian attitudes toward female sexuality and power. Here's a woman who took the throne initially as regent for her young stepson, then basically said, you know what, I'm keeping this job, and ruled one of the most powerful empires in the world for over 2 decades. But here's the twist: instead of hiding her femininity or apologizing for her gender, Hatshepsut actively celebrated her role as both sexual being and divine ruler. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari features relief carvings showing her divine conception and birth, complete with the god Amun-Ra having sex with her mother to create this future pharaoh. The artwork doesn't shy away from the sexual nature of divine conception. It embraces it as proof of legitimacy. Even more telling, Hatshepsut maintained what appears to have been a romantic relationship with her architect Senumit, who designed her incredible temple complex. Their relationship was documented in art and architecture, with Senumit's image appearing in her temple's most sacred spaces, something that would have been scandalous in other ancient cultures, but was apparently perfectly acceptable in Egypt when Hatshepsut died. Her successors tried to erase her from history by defacing her monuments, but they left the sexual imagery intact, because destroying representations of divine sexuality would have been sacrilege. The consequences of Hatshepsut's reign extended far beyond her lifetime. She proved that female sexuality and political power could coexist, that women could rule without abandoning their nature as sexual beings, and that Egyptian society was genuinely committed to gender equality rather than just paying lip service to progressive ideals. Modern parallels are striking. Imagine a contemporary female leader whose sexual relationships were openly celebrated rather than scrutinized, whose femininity was seen as a source of strength rather than weakness, and whose legacy was built on both political achievement and personal authenticity. And if you think that's impressive, wait until you hear about the workers' village, where ordinary Egyptians were writing love letters on pottery shards and creating the world's first erotic comic strips. This wasn't just about individual relationships or personal freedom. Egyptian attitudes towards sexuality shaped their entire worldview and social structure in ways that would influence human civilization for millennia. When a culture genuinely believes that sexual energy is the creative force behind the universe itself, everything changes. Law, religion, art, medicine, family structure, economic relationships, all of it gets filtered through this fundamental understanding that sexuality is sacred rather than shameful. The implications were staggering. Egyptian women enjoyed legal rights that wouldn't appear in Western civilization until the 20th century. Their medical knowledge of contraception, fertility, and sexual health was more advanced than what most people had access to until the modern era. Their artistic expressions of sexuality were more honest and sophisticated than what many contemporary societies produce. Their integration of sexual imagery into religious practice created a holistic worldview that didn't separate sacred and secular, spiritual and physical, in the ways that would dominate later civilizations. But this also meant that when Egypt finally fell to less sexually progressive conquerors, humanity lost something irreplaceable. The Christian Roman Empire, medieval Islamic caliphates, and eventually European colonial powers all brought their own sexual anxieties and restrictions to bear on this ancient tradition of sexual freedom. Centuries of sexually repressive religious doctrine and patriarchal social structures buried the Egyptian model so thoroughly that we're only now beginning to understand what we lost. The stakes extend to our modern world as well. Understanding how Egyptian civilization managed to combine sexual freedom with social stability, gender equality with cultural continuity, and individual pleasure with collective responsibility offers potential roadmaps for contemporary societies struggling with their own relationships between sexuality and social order. But Hatshepsut and her architect were just the beginning of this story. The real revelation comes when you start examining how ordinary Egyptians, not pharaohs or priests, but regular working people, approach love, sex, and relationships in their daily lives. From the workers' villages, where archaeologists have uncovered thousands of intimate letters and erotic drawings, to the medical papyri that read like ancient sex education manuals, to the legal contracts that protected both partners' rights in ways that would impress modern family lawyers. The deeper you dig into Egyptian sexuality, the more revolutionary it becomes. We're about to explore a civilization that created the world's first pregnancy tests, wrote love poetry that could top the modern charts, and developed legal frameworks for relationships that were more progressive than what most countries have today. The evidence is overwhelming, the stories are incredible, and the implications will change how you think about human sexuality, ancient history, and maybe even your own relationships. Divine sexuality was the cornerstone of Egyptian cosmology, and unlike every other ancient religious system or probably studied, Egyptian gods weren't ashamed of their sexual desires. They flaunted them as cosmic creative forces. The Heliopolitan creation myth doesn't begin with mysterious divine commands or abstract spiritual emanations. It starts with Atum, the creator god, literally masturbating the universe into existence through what the texts poetically call the work of his hand. This wasn't some embarrassing detail that priests tried to hide. It was the foundational truth of Egyptian religion. Historical context makes this even more remarkable. While Mesopotamian gods were depicted as temperamental rulers who demanded fear and submission, while Greek deities were portrayed as powerful but flawed beings whose sexuality often led to conflict and tragedy, Egyptian gods integrated sexuality into their divine nature as a positive, creative force. The god Min appeared at festivals with his massive erect phallus prominently displayed, celebrated by entire communities as the patron of male virility and agricultural fertility. Hathor danced through temples with her sistrum rattles, openly patronizing sexual pleasure alongside maternal care and divine protection. This developed because Egyptian theology was fundamentally about cosmic order and balance, and sexuality was understood as essential to maintaining that balance. Sexual energy didn't disrupt divine order, it sustained it. Creation required sexual force, death was conquered through sexual resurrection, and annual renewal depended on sexual fertility. The gods weren't transcending their sexuality, they were expressing divinity through it. Take the myth of Osiris and Isis, which every Egyptian knew from childhood, and which shaped their understanding of love, death, and sexual power. Osiris, the god-king of Egypt, was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, who scattered the pieces across the land to prevent resurrection. Isis, Osiris's wife and sister, gathered the body parts with one crucial problem. Set had thrown Osiris's penis into the Nile, where it was eaten by a fish. So what did Isis do? She crafted a magical golden phallus, used her divine sexual power to resurrect her husband just long enough for one final act of love, and conceived Horus during that mystical sexual union. This wasn't treated as weird or scandalous, it was the ultimate triumph of love over death, sexual energy over destruction, female power over male violence. The story was carved into temple walls, painted in tombs, and retold in religious ceremonies throughout Egyptian history. The annual Opet festival in Thebes reenacted divine sexuality on a massive scale. The god Amun would travel from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple in a sacred boat procession, symbolically fertilizing the land and ensuring the pharaoh's divine legitimacy through ritual sexual union. Entire communities participated in celebration that combined religious devotion with openly sexual imagery and festivities. One contemporary description mentions that the people rejoiced and made merry in ways that clearly included sexual celebration as part of religious observance. Meanwhile, the god Bes, depicted as a dwarf with prominent genitalia, appeared on household items throughout Egypt, protecting sexuality, childbirth, and domestic happiness. Egyptian beds were carved with Bes imagery. Mirrors featured Bes handles, and amulets showing Bes's exaggerated sexual characteristics were worn for protection in intimate moments. This wasn't considered vulgar or inappropriate. It was sacred. Protection for one of life's most important activities. The human interest angle is remarkable. Regular Egyptian families decorated their homes with sexual imagery because they believed divine sexuality would bless their own relationships. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages shows that even the poorest Egyptians surrounded themselves with sexual symbolism as a form of spiritual practice. But it wasn't that simple, because Egyptian divine sexuality operated according to complex rules that seem contradictory to modern observers. While the gods openly displayed sexual characteristics and engaged in sexual activities, human sexuality was expected to follow specific patterns that maintained cosmic order. Divine sexuality was portrayed as fundamentally creative and life-giving, while human sexuality needed to be channeled properly to avoid chaos. For instance, the god Set sexuality was depicted as destructive and chaotic. He was shown raping both men and women, committing incest in harmful ways, and using sexual violence as a weapon of disorder. Egyptian mythology distinguished between sexuality that maintained matter and sexuality that disrupted it, creating a complex moral framework that wasn't simply pro-sex or anti-sex, but rather pro-order and anti-chaos. This created interesting complications. In daily life, adultery was severely punished because it disrupted social order, but premarital sex carried no stigma because it didn't threaten established relationships. Homosexual activity appears in some religious contexts as positive, but in others as negative, depending on whether it was portrayed as orderly or chaotic. The Egyptians weren't operating with simple binary categories of good sex versus bad sex. They were thinking about sexual behavior in terms of its effects on cosmic and social harmony. Even more confusing to modern minds, Egyptian royal sexuality followed completely different rules than common sexuality. Pharaohs practiced polygamy and occasional incest as divine prerogatives, while ordinary Egyptians were expected to maintain monogamous relationships. This wasn't hypocrisy. It reflected Egyptian understanding that divine sexuality operated according to different principles than human sexuality. The tension appears clearly in artistic representations. Formal temple and tomb art rarely showed explicit sexual activities, maintaining decorums appropriate for sacred and eternal contexts, while household objects, private papyri, and informal artwork celebrated sexuality openly. Egyptians understood that different contexts required different expressions of sexual energy. The result was a religious culture that integrated sexuality into spiritual practice in ways that would influence Egyptian society for 3 millennia. Egyptian temples included healing chambers where people sought divine assistance for reproductive and sexual health. Priests and priestesses performed fertility rituals that included sexual imagery and symbolism. Religious festivals celebrated divine sexuality through community participation that connected human relationships to cosmic renewal. Who was affected? Everyone. Egyptian children grew up surrounded by positive representations of sexuality as divine creative force. Adults incorporated sexual symbolism into their spiritual practices, their household decorations, and their understanding of cosmic order. Women found religious justification for sexual agency and reproductive control. Men learned that sexual energy was sacred responsibility rather than simple pleasure or dominance display. How people responded varied by class and region, but the overall pattern remained remarkably consistent. Archaeological evidence shows that both urban and rural communities, wealthy and poor families, and different ethnic groups within Egypt all participated in this religious understanding of sexuality. The consistency suggests deep cultural commitment rather than imposed ideology. Institutional reactions were generally supportive rather than restrictive. Egyptian priests maintained temples that celebrated sexuality, courts enforced laws that protected sexual rights, and schools taught medical knowledge about sexual health. The state apparatus reinforced, rather than repressed, the religious framework that elevated sexuality to divine status. Long-term implications extended far beyond Egypt's borders. When Greek and Roman scholars encountered Egyptian religious sexuality, they often misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented it as primitive fertility worship, disgusting excess. Early Christian writers particularly attacked Egyptian sexual attitudes as evidence of pagan corruption. These misrepresentations shaped Western understanding of ancient sexuality for centuries, making Egyptian sexual progressiveness appear either barbaric or imaginary. Meanwhile, this divine framework for understanding sexuality was creating something unprecedented in human history, a legal and social system that treated women as equal partners in sexual relationships, rather than property to be controlled by fathers and husbands. While other ancient civilizations developed patriarchal systems that restricted female sexuality to ensure male lineage control, Egyptians were building legal frameworks that protected women's sexual autonomy and reproductive rights. The connection between divine sexuality and human equality wasn't accidental. When your gods demonstrate that sexual energy is creative and sacred, it becomes much harder to justify systems that treat half the population as sexual objects rather than sexual subjects. We're about to explore how this played out in daily life. From marriage contracts that would impress modern feminists to divorce laws that protected both partners' rights, from contraceptive knowledge that surpassed medieval medicine to love poetry that celebrated female desire alongside male passion. If divine sexuality was Egypt's theological foundation, then their approach to marriage and legal rights was the practical revolution that changed everything about how human relationships actually functioned. While other ancient civilizations were developing increasingly complex systems to control women's sexuality and ensure patriarchal inheritance, Egyptians were busy creating what amounts to the world's first egalitarian marriage system. No wedding ceremonies, no priestly blessings, no legal requirements. Marriage happened when a woman moved her possessions into a man's house, establishing what they called GRGP, or founding a house together. This simplicity masked incredibly sophisticated legal arrangements that protected both partners' rights through detailed contracts that would impress modern family lawyers. Egyptian women enjoyed legal autonomy that wouldn't appear in Western civilization for millennia. They could own property independently, initiate divorce at will, live without male guardians, negotiate their own marriage terms, and basically tell any unsatisfactory husband to pack his stuff and leave. Meanwhile, Egyptian men were legally required to financially support ex-wives and couldn't remarry without settling previous obligations. Context for this development shows how unique Egypt was becoming. While Mesopotamian law codes like Hammurabi's were creating detailed hierarchies of sexual control and punishment, while early Hebrew texts were developing purity laws that restricted female sexuality, while Greek city-states were building systems where women were essentially permanent minors under male guardianship, Egypt was moving in the opposite direction, toward greater sexual equality and individual autonomy. Why this became important was that Egyptian inheritance and property laws recognized both male and female lineages, making women's economic independence essential to social stability rather than threatening to patriarchal control. When women can inherit property, manage businesses, and accumulate wealth independently, it becomes impossible to treat them as sexual property without destroying the economic system. Consider the marriage contract from Saqqara dating to the 27th dynasty, around 500 BCE, which reads like a modern prenuptial agreement written by a very savvy woman. The bride, Mibtahaya, daughter of Masaya, negotiated terms that would protect her property, specify her husband's financial obligations, and predetermine divorce settlements, all while maintaining her right to independent business activities and property ownership. The background here is fascinating. Mibtahaya was married 3 times during her life, each time negotiating increasingly favorable terms as she gained experience and wealth. Her first marriage was arranged by her father when she was young, but by her second and third marriages, she was completely in control of the negotiations. The contracts specify that she retained ownership of her house, her slaves, her business interests, and her accumulated dowry regardless of how the marriage ended. What happened next reveals how these arrangements actually worked in practice. When Mibtahaya's second husband died, she inherited part of his estate according to their contract, but she also faced legal challenges from his relatives who tried to claim her property. The court records show that Egyptian judges consistently upheld women's contractual rights against male relatives, reinforcing the principle that marriage contracts superseded traditional family claims. The key players included not just Mibtahaya and her husbands, but a whole network of female relatives, business partners, and legal advocates who supported women's economic independence. Egyptian society had developed institutions, courts, scribes, witnesses, even female business networks, that made women's legal equality practical rather than just theoretical. The drama and conflict came when these Egyptian practices encountered foreign legal systems during periods of Persian and Greek rule. Foreign administrators often tried to impose their own patriarchal marriage laws, leading to legal battles where Egyptian women fought to maintain their traditional rights. Remarkably, they usually won these battles, demonstrating how deeply gender equality was embedded in Egyptian legal culture. The resolution, or rather lack thereof, shows Egyptian persistence, even under foreign rule. Egyptian marriage contracts continued to protect women's rights. Egyptian courts continued to enforce gender-equal inheritance laws, and Egyptian society continued to operate according to its own principles rather than adopting foreign patriarchal systems. Human elements emerge clearly from personal letters and legal documents. We have love letters between spouses that discuss business partnerships alongside romantic feelings, divorce settlements that show mutual respect even when relationships ended, and family correspondence that treats women's property rights as completely normal rather than unusual. The broader significance extends beyond individual relationships to demonstrate how sexual equality could be institutionalized through legal systems that protected both partners' autonomy while encouraging stable relationships. This wasn't isolated to a few exceptional women or unusual time periods. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites across Egypt and spanning centuries shows consistent patterns of female property ownership, independent business activity, and egalitarian marriage arrangements. The pattern held true for different social classes, ethnic groups, and historical periods, suggesting deep cultural commitment rather than temporary aberration. Other examples include thousands of business documents showing women as property owners, contract makers, and independent economic actors. Legal papyri demonstrate women initiating divorces, negotiating settlements, and representing themselves in court without male guardians. Tomb inscriptions celebrate women's achievements in business, religion, and family life as equally valuable to men's accomplishments. Pattern explanation reveals several key factors that made Egyptian gender equality sustainable. First, their inheritance system recognized both paternal and maternal lineages, making women's economic independence essential to family continuity. Second, their religious system portrayed female sexuality as divine creative force rather than dangerous temptation. Third, their economic system depended on women's labor in agriculture, textile production, and commerce, making female subordination economically irrational. Why this pattern existed becomes clearer when you consider Egypt's unique geographic and cultural development. The Nile Valley's agricultural abundance meant that survival didn't depend on constant warfare and male physical dominance. Egypt's cultural continuity over millennia allowed gender-equal traditions to develop and persist without constant disruption. From conquest and cultural change, Egypt's religious emphasis on cosmic balance created ideological frameworks that valued harmony and cooperation over dominance and submission. Social, political, and economic factors all reinforced gender equality. Politically, Egypt's pharaonic system included multiple examples of successful female rulers, normalizing women's leadership capacity. Economically, women's contributions to agriculture, craft production, and trade were essential to Egyptian prosperity. Socially, family structures that valued both male and female contributions created stable foundations for gender-equal relationships. Comparison to other time periods and places highlights Egyptian exceptionalism. While medieval European women were fighting for basic property rights, Egyptian women had enjoyed those rights for millennia. While Confucian societies were developing elaborate systems of female subordination, Egypt maintained gender equality, while Islamic law created complex restrictions on women's activities. Egyptian women continued managing independent businesses and property holdings. The effects were transformative for everyone involved in Egyptian society. Women benefited from economic independence, legal protection, and social respect that enhanced both individual autonomy and family stability. Men benefited from partnerships with educated, capable women who contributed economically and intellectually to household success. Children grew up in families where both parents were respected as individuals, creating models of gender equality that perpetuated through generations. Who benefited most were probably middle-class families, where women's economic contributions were essential to social mobility and prosperity. Archaeological evidence from sites like Deir el-Medina shows that artisan families achieved remarkable stability and prosperity through partnerships, where both spouses contributed specialized skills and business connections. Who suffered were primarily foreign administrators and male immigrants from patriarchal societies who found Egyptian gender equality threatening to their assumptions about natural social order. Some evidence suggests that Greek and Roman men living in Egypt complained about Egyptian women's independence and legal rights, seeing them as challenges to proper masculine authority. Unintended consequences included Egypt's eventual vulnerability to conquest by more militaristic societies. Some historians argue that Egypt's emphasis on gender equality and cooperative social structures made them less prepared for warfare against societies organized around male dominance and military hierarchy. Of course, Egypt lasted for 3 millennia, so this weakness was apparently pretty effective. How this shaped future developments was complex. Egyptian gender equality influenced Hellenistic and Roman legal systems in Egypt, creating hybrid approaches that preserved some women's rights even under patriarchal rule. Early Christian communities in Egypt included strong traditions of female leadership and independence that differed from Christian practices elsewhere. Islamic Egypt maintained some Egyptian legal traditions that protected women's property rights more than Islamic law typically allowed. Modern parallels are striking when you consider that Egypt achieved legal gender equality 3,000 years before most contemporary societies. Egyptian marriage contracts protected women's rights more effectively than many modern prenuptial agreements. Egyptian divorce laws were more equitable than what many countries have today. Egyptian women's business and property rights exceeded what women in some parts of the world currently enjoy. Yet, even as Egyptians were revolutionizing legal and social approaches to marriage and gender equality, they were simultaneously developing something equally remarkable: a literary and artistic culture that celebrated sexual desire, romantic love, and emotional intimacy in ways that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. The same society that created egalitarian marriage contracts was also producing love poetry that could top contemporary charts, erotic artwork that makes modern expressions look tame, and medical texts that read like ancient sex education manuals. The connection wasn't accidental. When your legal system treats both partners as equal participants in sexual relationships, it becomes natural to celebrate sexuality as mutual pleasure rather than male dominance and female submission. By around 1150 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses V in what historians call the Late New Kingdom period, Egyptian sexual expression had reached a breaking point where artistic freedom collided with social commentary in ways that would scandalize scholars for the next 3,000 years and reveal the full extent of Egyptian sexual sophistication that other civilizations couldn't even imagine, let alone achieve. The creation of what we now call the Turin Erotic papyrus represents perhaps the most audacious artistic statement about sexuality, class relationships, and political power ever produced in the ancient world, an 8.5-foot scroll that combines explicit sexual imagery with biting social satire in ways that would make modern political cartoonists blush with embarrassment at their own timidity. The tensions involved were complex and multifaceted, reflecting deeper social problems that were affecting Egyptian civilization during this period of transition and decline. Egypt was entering a phase of economic uncertainty, social upheaval, and political instability that would eventually end the New Kingdom and transform Egyptian society in fundamental ways that affected everything from religious practice to international relations. Foreign invasions, internal corruption, administrative inefficiency, and economic inequality were creating social stress that needed outlets for expression, criticism, and commentary that wouldn't directly challenge political authority, but could address social problems through artistic and cultural means. Meanwhile, Egypt's traditional sexual liberalism was encountering new pressures from increasing foreign influence and changing social dynamics that were beginning to modify Egyptian attitudes towards sexuality, gender relationships, and artistic expression in ways that created tension between traditional Egyptian values and emerging foreign influences that would eventually transform Egyptian culture completely. Key players included the anonymous artist, who created this remarkable masterpiece, demonstrating artistic skill, cultural knowledge, and satirical genius that combined technical excellence with social commentary in ways that required deep understanding of both artistic traditions and contemporary social problems. The scribes and patrons who commissioned and preserved this work represented social networks that appreciated sophisticated artistic expression and were willing to support controversial cultural commentary despite potential political risks. The entire social community of people who apparently found its contents entertaining rather than shocking reveals Egyptian sexual attitudes that remained remarkably open and sophisticated even during periods of social stress and cultural change. The stakes were significant because this papyrus pushes Egyptian sexual expression to its absolute limits, testing social boundaries and challenging power structures through explicit imagery that was simultaneously hilarious and subversive, entertaining and critical, artistic and political in ways that demonstrated Egyptian confidence in their sexual attitudes even when other aspects of their civilization were under pressure from internal problems and external threats that might have been expected to create more conservative or restrictive approaches to sexual expression and artistic freedom. What makes this particularly dramatic and significant is that the papyrus survived for over 3 millennia, hidden in Egyptian tombs and eventually discovered by European archaeologists who were so shocked by its contents that they literally locked it away from public view for decades, while debating whether such explicit material could possibly have been created by ancient people who were supposed to have been sexually repressed and artistically primitive according to Victorian assumptions about ancient civilizations and human sexual development. Picture this scene: an ancient Egyptian artist, probably working in the royal scriptorium at Thebes during one of history's most politically turbulent periods, decides to create the world's first illustrated sex manual combined with the world's first erotic political cartoon. And he's going to do it with such artistic skill and satirical genius that it will survive for 3 millennia and still shock people who think they understand ancient sexuality. The Turin Erotic papyrus unfolds like an ancient Egyptian Saturday Night Live sketch, featuring 12 explicit sexual positions performed by characters that look like they wandered out of a comedy club for a particularly raucous night of entertainment. The build-up is evident in the papyrus's carefully constructed structure that reveals sophisticated artistic planning and cultural understanding. It begins with relatively tame images of animals in human situations that establish the satirical framework. A mouse wearing pharaohs' regalia and commanding other animals. A cat herding geese in ways that parody agricultural management. A lion playing board games with an antelope in scenes that mock aristocratic leisure activities. The humor builds gradually and systematically, establishing the artist's satirical intent and comedic skill before moving into the explicitly sexual scenes that follow and transform the scroll from clever animal fable into devastating social commentary. Key moments reveal the artist's genius for combining technical excellence with cultural criticism in ways that required deep knowledge of both artistic traditions and contemporary social problems. The male figures are portrayed as scruffy, balding, short, and paunchy characters with exaggerated genitalia that seems almost cartoonish in its proportions, clearly representing wealthy, but physically unattractive men who are using money or social status to access beautiful women rather than attracting them through personal appeal or genuine charm. Meanwhile, the women are depicted with classical Egyptian beauty standards, tall, elegant, graceful, and undeniably desirable, but their facial expressions and body language suggest they're performing roles rather than experiencing genuine passion or satisfaction. The contrast is clearly intentional and brilliantly executed, creating visual comedy that suggests something satirical and critical about relationships between social classes, economic inequality, and sexual relationships that had become corrupted by wealth and power rather than based on mutual attraction and genuine affection. What dialogue or quotes we can reconstruct from hieroglyphic captions and accompanying text suggests that the sexual encounters are taking place in a brothel or festival setting, with commentary that appears both instructional and humorous, offering practical advice about sexual techniques while simultaneously mocking the participants and their motivations. The captions describe positions, techniques, and apparently include jokes that would have been hilarious to contemporary audiences, but require scholarly interpretation for modern readers to understand the full extent of their wit and cultural significance. The play-by-play of important scenes shows remarkable artistic sophistication that combines technical skill with cultural knowledge and satirical genius. Each sexual position is rendered with anatomical accuracy that demonstrates genuine understanding of human sexuality and reproductive biology. Artistic skill that rivals the finest Egyptian tomb paintings in terms of line quality and compositional balance, and creative humor that transforms potentially pornographic imagery into sophisticated social commentary that works on multiple levels simultaneously. Character motivations appear complex and multi-layered when you analyze the imagery carefully and consider the social context in which it was created. The male figures seem to represent wealthy and physically declining members of Egyptian society who are using economic resources or political influence to access sexual relationships with beautiful women who wouldn't be interested in them under other circumstances. The women appear to be participating willingly in these arrangements, but with expressions and postures that suggest they're providing services rather than experiencing genuine pleasure or emotional connection. The overall effect creates devastating critique of social relationships where economic inequality and political corruption had distorted sexual relationships and turned them into commercial transactions rather than expressions of mutual attraction, love, or even simple physical pleasure between people who genuinely desired each other as individuals rather than as symbols of wealth, status, or physical beauty that could be purchased rather than earned through personal merit. Unexpected developments emerge when you realize that this isn't just ancient pornography created for male entertainment, but sophisticated social commentary disguised as sexual entertainment that uses erotic imagery to make serious points about political corruption, economic inequality, and social decay that were affecting Egyptian society during this period of decline and transition. The papyrus appears to be criticizing the corruption and decadence of Egyptian elite society during a time when traditional values were being abandoned in favor of wealth accumulation and status competition that destroyed authentic human relationships. The climax comes in the papyrus's final scenes, where the sexual imagery becomes most explicit and the social commentary most pointed and devastating. The final images show sexual positions that seem physically impossible or at least extremely uncomfortable, suggesting that the artist is pushing satire into pure fantasy while making points about social and sexual relationships that had become equally fantastical and disconnected from reality, authentic human emotion, or genuine mutual satisfaction. Immediate aftermath involved the papyrus being carefully preserved and eventually buried with its owner, suggesting that despite its controversial content, it was valued as important artistic and cultural expression, rather than discarded as obscene material that threatens social values or religious principles. The fact that it survived in good condition indicates that ancient Egyptian audiences treated it with respect and appreciation rather than trying to destroy it as inappropriate or dangerous cultural expression that might corrupt public morals or challenge political authority. The response was apparently positive, at least among the people wealthy and sophisticated enough to commission, appreciate, and preserve such artwork over extended periods. The papyrus's survival in good condition and its careful burial with other valuable possessions suggests that ancient Egyptian audiences found its combination of sexual explicitness and social commentary entertaining, enlightening, and culturally valuable rather than shocking, offensive, or politically dangerous, in ways that would have motivated its destruction or suppression. This tells us something remarkable and important about Egyptian sexual attitudes that goes far beyond simple tolerance or liberal social policies. They could appreciate sophisticated erotic art that pushed boundaries, challenged conventions, and made serious social criticism without becoming outraged, demanding censorship, or calling for punishment of artists who created controversial cultural commentary that addressed sensitive political and social issues through sexual imagery and satirical humor. Various parties' reactions can be inferred from archaeological context and the broader pattern of Egyptian artistic expression at this period. The papyrus was found in a tomb belonging to a middle-class family, suggesting that appreciation for erotic art extended beyond royal or priestly elites to include ordinary people with enough wealth to commission quality artwork and sophisticated enough cultural understanding to appreciate complex satirical commentary that combines sexual entertainment with social criticism. The careful preservation indicates that families valued such pieces enough to include them in burial goods meant for eternity, treating them as legitimate cultural artifacts worthy of eternal preservation rather than temporary entertainment that could be discarded when its immediate purpose was served. This suggests that Egyptians understood erotic art as having lasting cultural and spiritual value rather than merely serving immediate physical or entertainment purposes. Immediate consequences included influence on later Egyptian erotic art and satirical traditions. Archaeological discoveries have revealed other papyri, estraka, and artistic works that show similar combinations of sexual imagery and social commentary, suggesting that the Turin papyrus was part of a broader artistic tradition rather than an isolated anomaly created by a single eccentric artist working outside established cultural norms and expectations. Egyptian artists apparently had established traditions of using sexual imagery for satirical purposes, political commentary, and social criticism that were accepted and appreciated by audiences who understood the conventions references, and cultural context that made such artwork meaningful rather than simply shocking or entertaining without deeper significance. Political and social fallout was probably minimal within Egyptian society, which had long traditions of artistic freedom and sexual expression that made such works acceptable rather than scandalous or threatening to established social order. However, the papyrus provides important evidence of social tensions and class conflicts that were affecting Egyptian society during this period of political decline, economic uncertainty, and cultural transition that would eventually transform Egyptian civilization completely. How this changed everything, or nothing, depends on your perspective and the time frame you're considering. For ancient Egyptians, the papyrus probably represented continuity with established traditions of sexual expression and artistic freedom, rather than radical departure from social norms or revolutionary challenge to political authority that required significant social adjustment or institutional response. For modern scholars, it revealed Egyptian sexual attitudes that had been completely misunderstood and misrepresented for centuries by researchers who couldn't believe that ancient people had been so sexually sophisticated, artistically creative, and culturally confident that they could create and preserve artwork that combined explicit sexuality with political satire in ways that exceeded what many contemporary societies would tolerate or appreciate. Ironic outcomes include the papyrus becoming one of the most studied and discussed artifacts from ancient Egypt, precisely because its sexual content initially shocked modern scholars into hiding it away from public view and academic discussion. What Egyptian artists created as entertainment and social commentary for their contemporaries became crucial evidence for understanding ancient sexuality that scholars had been denying, ignoring, or systematically misrepresenting for centuries due to their own cultural biases and sexual anxieties. This papyrus wasn't just ancient pornography or even sophisticated erotic art. It was a window into how Egyptians understood the relationships between sexuality, social class, political power, and artistic expression in ways that reveal fundamental aspects of their civilization. The fact that such explicit sexual imagery could be combined with social commentary and treated as legitimate artistic expression demonstrates Egyptian sexual sophistication that surpassed most later civilizations. Deeper meaning emerges when you consider that the papyrus represents Egyptian confidence in their sexual attitudes and artistic traditions even during periods of political instability and social change, rather than becoming more restrictive about sexual expression during times of crisis. Egyptians apparently doubled down on their commitment to sexual freedom and artistic honesty. What it revealed about the system and society was that Egyptian sexual liberalism wasn't just surface tolerance, but deep cultural commitment that persisted even when other aspects of civilization were under stress. The papyrus shows a society where sexuality could be discussed, depicted, and satirized openly without threatening social stability or moral order. Long-term effects included the papyrus becoming evidence that would eventually help modern scholars understand ancient Egyptian sexuality more accurately than had been possible for centuries. When combined with other archaeological discoveries, the Turin papyrus helped reconstruct Egyptian sexual attitudes that had been systematically misrepresented by scholars who couldn't believe ancient people had been so sexually sophisticated. Why historians still debate relates to questions about interpretation and context that remain unresolved. Some scholars see the papyrus as evidence of Egyptian sexual decadence during periods of decline, while others interpret it as sophisticated, artistic commentary that demonstrates cultural confidence and creative freedom. Still others argue that it represents working class perspectives on elite sexuality, or alternatively, that it shows elite attitudes toward prostitution and commercial sex. The debates continue, because the papyrus challenges assumptions about ancient sexuality, artistic expression, and social commentary in ways that force scholars to reconsider fundamental questions about how civilizations integrate sexual attitudes with cultural values. Modern academic discussions reveal as much about contemporary sexual anxieties as they do about ancient Egyptian attitudes, demonstrating how difficult it remains for scholars to approach ancient sexuality without imposing modern judgments and assumptions. To understand Egyptian sexuality in its full complexity and appreciate why it succeeded so remarkably for such an extended period, you have to understand the cultural elements that made their progressive attitudes possible, practical, and sustainable across 3 millennia of social change, political upheaval, and cultural evolution that might have been expected to undermine or eliminate sexual equality and individual freedom if they had been superficial policy innovations rather than deep cultural commitments integrated into fundamental social institutions and daily life practices. Daily life in ancient Egypt was organized around agricultural cycles that required extensive cooperation between men and women and the further than rigid separation of male and female roles that characterized other ancient civilizations and created practical arguments for gender hierarchy based on supposed natural differences in capability, appropriate activities, and social responsibilities. During planting and harvest seasons, everyone worked together regardless of gender, age, or social status, creating practical foundations for sexual equality that extended naturally into other areas of life and made gender partnership seem normal, rather than unusual or threatening to established social order. The Nile's annual flood cycle created agricultural abundance that reduced competition for basic resources and eliminated survival pressures that might have created arguments for male dominance based on physical strength, military protection, or resource control that characterized societies where scarcity and conflict made cooperation seem less practical than hierarchical organization and competitive resource allocation that favored physically powerful groups at the expense of others. Beliefs and attitudes were shaped by religious systems that portrayed both male and female principles as essential to cosmic order, divine creativity, and spiritual development in ways that made gender equality seem religiously required rather than socially optional or culturally innovative. Unlike religious systems that saw sexuality as distraction from spiritual development or female nature as spiritually inferior to male nature, Egyptian theology made sexuality integral to spiritual practice and portrayed both masculine and feminine divine principles as equally necessary for cosmic harmony and individual spiritual achievement. The concept of cosmic balance and order, required integration of opposing forces rather than dominance of one principle over another, creating religious frameworks where sexual partnership, gender equality, and individual autonomy were understood as spiritual necessities rather than social preferences that could be modified according to political convenience or cultural fashion without disrupting fundamental cosmic relationships. Social structures were built around extended family networks that valued both maternal and paternal lineages as equally important to family identity, economic prosperity, and social status, making women's contributions to family continuity as crucial as men's and creating practical incentives for treating women as equal partners rather than subordinate dependents whose interests could be sacrificed to male preferences without damaging family welfare and social stability. Property inheritance systems that recognized both male and female lineages meant that maintaining good relationships with women was essential to family economic success and social advancement, while marriage alliances and business partnerships required negotiation and cooperation rather than domination and submission that might have damaged relationships and reduced opportunities for mutual benefit and collective prosperity. What was normal versus exceptional becomes clearer when you examine archaeological evidence from ordinary households rather than just royal tombs and temple inscriptions that might have represented ideal standards rather than daily reality. Workers' villages like Deir al-Medina show that gender equality, sexual freedom, and mutual respect in relationships were standard expectations rather than unusual ideals that most people couldn't achieve due to economic constraints, social pressure, or cultural limitations. Love letters between spouses discuss business partnerships alongside romantic feelings. Legal documents show women conducting independent economic activities. Household inventories reveal shared ownership of property and resources and community. Records demonstrate women's participation in social activities, religious ceremonies, and local governance that required recognition as autonomous individuals, rather than dependent family members whose participation needed male approval or supervision. How this shaped events was that Egyptian cultural attitudes towards sexuality created social stability and individual satisfaction that allowed their civilization to persist for 3 millennia with remarkable consistency despite political changes, economic fluctuations, and foreign influences that transformed other aspects of Egyptian society, while leaving core sexual attitudes and gender relationships relatively unchanged, and continuously supportive of individual autonomy within stable community frameworks. When people's sexual and romantic needs are met within cultural frameworks that treat everyone with dignity and respect, when legal systems protect individual rights while encouraging stable relationships, when economic opportunities are available to both men and women, when religious traditions celebrate rather than restrict sexuality, it creates foundations for social order that don't require constant enforcement through repression, control, and punishment that characterize societies where sexual attitudes conflict with human nature and individual needs for autonomy, pleasure, and meaningful relationships. Perhaps most fascinating and instructive was how Egyptian sexual progressiveness coexisted with other aspects of their civilization that seem contradictory to modern observers who expect consistent application of egalitarian principles across all social relationships and institutional arrangements. This was a society that practiced slavery on a massive scale, built monuments through forced labor and corvée systems that required enormous human sacrifice, and maintained rigid social hierarchies that sharply limited opportunities for economic mobility and social advancement, yet somehow managed to achieve sexual equality and individual freedom in intimate relationships that surpassed what most modern societies have accomplished despite their supposed commitment to human rights and democratic values. Examples of contradictions include Egyptian willingness to grant women legal and sexual equality, while maintaining class distinctions that severely restricted social mobility and created permanent underclasses whose members could be bought, sold, and owned like property. Female slaves could be purchased and treated as possessions by free women who enjoyed extensive legal rights and social autonomy, creating situations where gender equality coexisted with other forms of human exploitation and social oppression. The same pharaohs who commanded absolute political authority and could order mass executions, forced relocations, and devastating military campaigns that destroyed entire cities and enslaved their populations apparently accepted that their wives could divorce them if the relationships became sexually or emotionally unsatisfactory, demonstrating remarkable limitation of male power in intimate relationships, despite unlimited authority in political and military contexts. Egyptian religious systems that celebrated sexuality and promoted gender equality also supported royal, divine kingship that treated pharaohs as living gods, whose commands were religiously binding and whose authority was absolute and unquestionable, creating theological frameworks that simultaneously promoted individual autonomy in personal relationships and demanded complete submission to political authority in public life. How things weren't what they seemed emerges when you realize that Egyptian sexual freedom operated within cultural frameworks that were actually quite structured, rule-bound, and carefully regulated, rather than representing anarchic liberation from all social constraints and behavioral expectations. While individuals enjoyed remarkable autonomy in choosing partners and negotiating relationships, those choices were still expected to maintain social harmony, family stability, and community welfare rather than serving purely individual desires. Without regard for collective consequences, sexual freedom didn't mean sexual chaos or elimination of all behavioral standards and social expectations. It meant sexual responsibility exercised through individual choice rather than external control, personal autonomy within supportive community frameworks, and individual satisfaction that enhanced rather than threatened collective stability and cultural continuity. Marriage arrangements were individually negotiated, but still required community recognition and legal documentation. Divorce was easily available but involved financial settlements and social obligations that protected both partners and any children. Sexual relationships were celebrated, but expected to contribute to, rather than detract from family prosperity and social harmony. Modern parallels to these contradictions appear throughout contemporary societies that combine sexual liberation with economic inequality, gender equality in some areas with discrimination in others, individual freedom with social conformity pressures, and progressive ideals with practical limitations that prevent full realization of egalitarian principles. Across all social relationships and institutional arrangements, like ancient Egypt, modern civilizations struggle to balance individual autonomy with collective stability, sexual freedom with social responsibility, progressive ideals with practical constraints, and egalitarian values with economic systems that create and maintain inequality in ways that limit human potential and social achievement, despite official commitment to human rights and democratic participation. The contradictions suggest that achieving sexual equality and individual freedom doesn't require perfecting all aspects of social organization simultaneously or eliminating all forms of inequality and oppression before making progress in specific areas that affect people's daily lives and personal relationships. Egyptian civilization managed to create remarkable progress in sexual attitudes and gender relationships while maintaining other practices that modern observers find problematic, offering both hope and caution for contemporary societies working toward their own versions of sexual equality and individual freedom within imperfect social systems that may never achieve complete justice or perfect equality across all human relationships and social institutions. Said the major themes of divine sexuality and legal equality. A fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in shaping Egyptian sexual culture. Meet Seneb, a dwarf court official from the Old Kingdom, whose tomb paintings show him with his wife and children in poses of obvious affection and equality. Remarkable because dwarfism, which might have marked someone as sexually undesirable in other ancient cultures, clearly didn't prevent Senub from achieving both political success and apparent marital happiness. His tomb art celebrates their relationship with the same dignity accorded to any other Egyptian couple, suggesting that physical differences didn't create sexual or social hierarchies the way they did elsewhere. Then there's Marit Tar, who lived around 2700 BCE and holds the distinction of being history's first named female physician. Her son described her as the chief physician in his tomb inscription, and medical papyri suggest that female doctors commonly treated reproductive and sexual health issues for both men and women. Marit Tar represents how Egyptian gender equality extended into professional medicine, creating opportunities for women to become experts in sexuality and reproduction in ways that would be impossible in more patriarchal societies. Consider Kamwaset, the fourth son of Ramesses II, who served as high priest of Torah at Memphis and conducted Egypt's first major archaeological restoration projects, but who also left behind personal papyri that link his romantic correspondence with multiple women, his detailed knowledge of contraceptive techniques, and his apparent belief that sexual pleasure was essential to spiritual development. Kamwaset showed how even the highest religious officials integrated sexuality into their spiritual practice, rather than seeing them as conflicting forces. And then there's Ankhesenemen, the widow of Tutankhamun, whose desperate letters to the Hittite king requesting marriage to one of his sons reveal both the political importance of royal sexuality and the personal agency that Egyptian queens maintained even in international diplomacy. Her correspondence shows a woman actively negotiating her own sexual and political future, rather than passively accepting arrangements made by male relatives. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of interconnected webs of relationships that demonstrate how Egyptian sexual attitudes created social networks based on mutual respect and individual agency, rather than hierarchical control. Senub's career advancement apparently depended partly on his wife's family connections and her independent wealth, showing how women's economic power translated into social influence that benefited entire families. His success created opportunities for other people with physical differences, establishing precedents that made Egyptian society more inclusive than most ancient civilizations. Marit's medical career was part of a broader network of female healthcare providers who shared knowledge about contraception, pregnancy, sexual health, and reproductive medicine through informal professional networks that operated alongside formal medical institutions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Deir el-Medina shows that women regularly consulted with other women about intimate health issues, creating knowledge-sharing systems that improved healthcare for entire communities. Kamwaset's romantic correspondence reveals connections to a whole network of educated women who were apparently his intellectual and sexual equals, women who could read and write, who understood religious philosophy, who engaged in theological discussions about the relationship between sexuality and spirituality. His letters suggest that Egyptian intellectual life included women as active participants rather than passive recipients of male wisdom. Political and social networks connected these individual stories to broader patterns of Egyptian social organization. Royal marriages like Ankhesenemen's created international alliances, but they also established precedents for how marriage negotiations should protect women's interests and acknowledge female agency. Middle-class professionals like Marit Tar created career pathways that made gender equality practical rather than just theoretical. Working-class families like Senebs demonstrated that Egyptian sexual attitudes extended across social classes rather than being limited to elite circles. How one event led to another shows the cumulative effect of individual choices that reinforced cultural patterns. When successful women like Marital trained other female physicians, they created professional traditions that institutionalized women's expertise in sexual and reproductive health. When royal women like Ankhesenamun negotiated their own marriages, they established precedents that protected other women's marital rights. When middle-class couples like Seneb and his wife demonstrated egalitarian relationships, they provided models that influenced community standards and expectations. Unintended consequences and connections reveal how Egyptian sexual attitudes created social dynamics that went far beyond individual relationships. The networks of female physicians created healthcare systems that served women's needs more effectively than male-dominated medical establishments could have. The precedents established by assertive royal women influenced legal frameworks that protected all women's rights. The examples set by successful egalitarian couples provided social proof that gender equality was practical and beneficial rather than disruptive and dangerous. To understand Egyptian sexuality, you have to understand the cultural elements that made their attitudes possible and sustainable. Daily life in ancient Egypt was organized around agricultural cycles that required cooperation between men and women rather than rigid separation of male and female roles. During planting and harvest seasons, everyone worked together regardless of gender, creating practical foundations for sexual equality that extended into other areas of life. Beliefs and attitudes were shaped by religious systems that portrayed both male and female principles as essential to cosmic order. Unlike religious systems that saw sexuality as distraction from spiritual development, Egyptian theology made sexuality integral to spiritual practice. This created cultural frameworks where sexual pleasure was understood as participation in divine creativity rather than deviation from sacred purposes. Social structures were built around extended family networks that valued both maternal and paternal lineages, making women's contributions to family continuity as important as men's. Property inheritance, business partnerships, and political alliances all depended on maintaining good relationships with both male and female relatives, creating practical incentives for treating women as equal partners rather than subordinate dependents. What was normal versus exceptional becomes clearer when you examine archaeological evidence from ordinary households rather than just royal tombs and temple inscriptions. Workers' villages like Deir el-Medina show that gender equality, sexual freedom, and mutual respect in relationships were standard expectations rather than unusual ideals. Love letters, business contracts, and legal documents all reflect assumptions about sexual equality that were apparently taken for granted rather than constantly negotiated. How this shaped events was that Egyptian cultural attitudes towards sexuality created social stability and individual satisfaction that allowed their civilization to persist for 3 millennia with remarkable consistency. When people's sexual and romantic needs are met within cultural frameworks that treat everyone with dignity and respect, it creates foundations for social order that don't require constant enforcement through repression and control. Perhaps most fascinating was how Egyptian sexual progressiveness coexisted with other aspects of their civilization that seemed contradictory to modern observers. This was a society that practiced slavery, built monuments through forced labor, and maintained rigid social hierarchies, yet somehow managed to achieve sexual equality and individual freedom in intimate relationships that surpassed what most modern societies have accomplished. Examples of contradictions include Egyptian willingness to grant women legal and sexual equality, while maintaining class distinctions that sharply limited opportunities for social mobility. Female slaves could be bought and sold like property, but free women enjoyed rights that wouldn't appear in other civilizations for millennia. The same pharaohs who commanded absolute political authority apparently accepted that their wives could divorce them if the relationships became unsatisfactory. How things weren't what they seemed emerges when you realize that Egyptian sexual freedom operated within cultural frameworks that were actually quite structured and rule-bound. While individuals enjoyed remarkable autonomy in choosing partners and negotiating relationships, those choices were still expected to maintain social harmony and family stability. Sexual freedom didn't mean sexual chaos. It meant sexual responsibility exercised through individual choice, rather than external control. Modern parallels to these contradictions appear in contemporary societies that combine sexual liberation with economic inequality, gender equality in some areas with discrimination in others, individual freedom with social conformity pressures. Like ancient Egypt, modern civilizations struggle to balance individual autonomy with collective stability, sexual freedom with social responsibility, progressive ideals with practical limitations. The contradictions suggest that achieving sexual equality and individual freedom doesn't require perfecting all aspects of social organization simultaneously. Egyptian civilization managed to create remarkable progress in sexual attitudes and gender relationships, while maintaining other practices that modern observers find problematic. This offers both hope and caution for contemporary societies working toward their own versions of sexual equality and individual freedom. Everything changed when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 330 BCE, not because he imposed immediate restrictions on Egyptian sexuality or attempted to eliminate gender equality through direct legal prohibition, but because his conquest opened Egypt to sustained foreign influence that would gradually erode 3 millennia of sexual progressiveness through cultural collision, economic pressure, and administrative modification, rather than dramatic suppression or sudden institutional transformation that would have created obvious resistance and political conflict. The Macedonian conquest marked the beginning of Ptolemaic rule that lasted 3 centuries and established patterns of foreign domination that would continue through Roman occupation and beyond, fundamentally altering the relationship between Egyptian cultural traditions and political authority in ways that slowly but systematically undermined indigenous social institutions and cultural practices that had supported gender equality and sexual freedom for thousands of years. Background to the change reveals that Egypt had survived previous foreign conquests, Persian rule under Cambyses and Darius, various Nubian and Libyan dynasties, even periods of internal fragmentation and civil war, while maintaining their distinctive sexual attitudes and gender relationships with remarkable consistency that demonstrated deep cultural commitment rather than superficial policy preferences that could be easily modified by political pressure or administrative convenience. What made the Hellenistic period different was the sustained nature of foreign settlement and cultural influence. The deliberate Greek effort to establish their own cultural institutions alongside Egyptian ones, rather than simply adopting local customs as previous conquerors had generally done, and the gradual integration of Egypt into Mediterranean economic and political systems that required conformity to foreign standards and practices that conflicted with traditional Egyptian approaches to sexuality, gender relationships, and individual autonomy. Why this moment was different becomes clear when you examine Ptolemaic marriage practices, legal innovations, and administrative policies that introduced Greek concepts of gender hierarchy and sexual control that directly contradicted Egyptian traditions of equality and individual freedom. While the Ptolemaic rulers couldn't immediately impose Greek law on Egyptian subjects without creating massive social disruption and political resistance, they established parallel legal systems and cultural institutions that created competing models of sexual relationships and gender roles within the same society. The Ptolemaic dynasty's adoption of brother-sister marriage as a royal prerogative, while maintaining divine justification for this practice through Egyptian religious traditions, began to separate royal sexuality from common sexuality in ways that had never existed during native Egyptian rule, when pharaohs and ordinary citizens operated under similar basic principles of sexual autonomy and relationship equality, despite differences in political power and economic resources. Key factors that led to transformation included the establishment of Alexandria as a cosmopolitan, Mediterranean city where Greek, Roman, Jewish, and other foreign communities lived alongside Egyptians, creating cultural mixing and intellectual exchange that gradually modified traditional Egyptian attitudes through daily contact with people who had different assumptions about proper gender relationships, sexual behavior, and individual autonomy. Within family and social structures, the influx of foreign immigrants who brought their own cultural practices and social expectations created pressure for Egyptians to adopt foreign customs in order to gain political advantages, economic opportunities, and social acceptance within the new multicultural environment that valued Mediterranean sophistication over indigenous Egyptian traditions that were increasingly portrayed as provincial and backward. The integration of Egypt into Hellenistic trade networks and political alliances required conformity to Greek and Roman legal standards, business practices, and social customs that often conflicted with Egyptian traditions of gender equality and sexual freedom, creating economic incentives for abandoning traditional practices in favor of foreign approaches that provided access to broader opportunities and resources. How change unfolded was gradual, systematic, and largely voluntary, rather than imposed through force or legal prohibition, operating through cultural influence, economic pressure, and social incentives, rather than direct suppression or violent elimination of traditional practices that would have created obvious resistance and political conflict. The process began with elite Egyptian families adopting Greek customs to gain political and economic advantages under Ptolemaic rule, then extended to middle-class families seeking social advancement and commercial opportunities, and eventually influenced working-class communities through economic relationships and urban cultural exchange. Greek and Roman immigrant women sometimes adopted Egyptian practices that gave them more freedom than they would have enjoyed in their home communities, creating interesting reversals where foreign women gained autonomy through contact with Egyptian traditions, while Egyptian women lost traditional rights through adoption of foreign practices that had been imposed through political and economic pressure rather than chosen through genuine preference or cultural conviction. Upper-class Egyptian families who successfully adapted to foreign rule often maintained some traditional practices in private while adopting foreign customs in public, creating dual cultural systems that preserve some Egyptian sexual attitudes. Within modified social frameworks, that met foreign expectations without completely abandoning indigenous traditions and personal preferences. But overall, the transformation represented a net loss of sexual equality and individual freedom that had defined Egyptian civilization for millennia, with particular impact on women's economic independence, legal autonomy, and social recognition, that reduced their opportunities and status in ways that affected entire families and communities rather than just individual relationships. New rules and norms included Roman legal requirements for male guardianship that applied to Egyptian women, despite their traditional legal independence. Christian moral codes that emphasized sexual restraint and female subordination as spiritual virtues rather than celebrating sexuality as divine gift, and economic systems that reduced women's independent business opportunities while increasing their dependence on male relatives and husbands for financial support and social protection. The new framework wasn't entirely foreign. It incorporated Egyptian elements and maintained some traditional practices where they didn't conflict with foreign requirements or threaten foreign authority. But the balance had shifted dramatically toward restriction and control rather than freedom and equality. Hierarchy and submission rather than partnership and mutual respect. External regulation rather than individual choice within supportive community frameworks. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically shows that some Egyptian practices proved remarkably resilient even under sustained foreign pressure and institutional modification. Egyptian medical knowledge about contraception and sexual health continued to influence Mediterranean practices through physicians, midwives, and medical texts that preserve traditional knowledge even when social attitudes towards sexuality became more restrictive and conventional. Egyptian artistic traditions maintained some celebration of sexuality and individual beauty in private contexts, household decorations, and personal items, even when public art became more modest and conventional according to foreign standards of propriety and religious appropriateness. Egyptian family structures preserved some traditions of mutual respect and cooperation between spouses, even when legal frameworks became more patriarchal and hierarchical, suggesting that personal relationships could maintain egalitarian characteristics, even within modified social and legal systems that officially favored male authority and female subordination. Was this change positive or negative? Different perspectives offer different answers that reveal how cultural transformation affects different groups in different ways, and how evaluation depends on values, priorities, and time frame that shape judgment about costs, benefits, and overall consequences of historical developments that created both opportunities and losses for different participants. From the perspective of Egyptian women who lost traditional rights and freedoms, the changes were clearly negative, reducing opportunities and autonomy that had been taken for granted for centuries, and creating new barriers to independence, self-determination, and personal satisfaction that affected not only individual women, but their families and communities who had benefited from women's contributions and participation in economic, social, and cultural activities. From the perspective of foreign administrators who believed patriarchal systems were more stable, predictable, and controllable than egalitarian arrangements, the changes were positive developments that brought Egypt into alignment with broader Mediterranean civilization and created more familiar and manageable social structures that reduced conflict with foreign cultural expectations and administrative requirements. Different perspectives also include those of Egyptian men, who gained some advantages through patriarchal systems that provided greater legal authority and social status, but lost partnerships with independent, capable women who had contributed to family prosperity and social stability through their economic activities, professional skills, and cultural knowledge that enhanced household resources and community welfare. Greek and Roman women who settled in Egypt sometimes found Egyptian traditions appealing compared to their home cultures, suggesting that the transformation wasn't uniformly welcomed even by foreign communities who might have been expected to prefer familiar cultural arrangements over indigenous practices that differed from their own expectations and social experiences. Short-term versus long-term effects show that immediate changes were often less dramatic than their cumulative impact over centuries of gradual modification and adjustment. Individual Egyptian families could maintain traditional practices for generations even under foreign rule, adapting to new requirements while preserving core values and relationship patterns that maintained family stability and personal satisfaction within changed circumstances. But institutional changes gradually modified cultural expectations and legal frameworks in ways that made traditional Egyptian sexuality increasingly difficult to sustain, creating pressure for conformity to foreign standards that eventually eliminated most vestiges of indigenous practices and created new social norms that differed fundamentally from traditional Egyptian approaches to gender relationships and sexual autonomy. Unintended consequences included the preservation of Egyptian sexual knowledge and practices in modified forms that influenced later Mediterranean and Islamic cultures in ways that the original foreign conquerors hadn't anticipated or intended. Egyptian medical texts on contraception and sexual health were copied and transmitted throughout the ancient world, carrying Egyptian innovations to societies that adapted them for their own use without necessarily adopting Egyptian social attitudes toward gender equality and sexual freedom. Egyptian artistic traditions influenced Hellenistic and Roman representations of sexuality and gender relationships in ways that made Mediterranean cultures more sexually sophisticated than they might otherwise have been, even when political and legal systems became more restrictive and patriarchal than traditional Egyptian arrangements had been. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals how cultural transformation processes are always complex and contradictory rather than simple stories of progress or decline, improvement or deterioration. Contemporary sources show that some Egyptians welcomed foreign influences as sophisticated improvements that provided access to broader opportunities and resources, while others mourned the loss of traditional freedoms and practices that had defined Egyptian identity and cultural achievement for thousands of years. Modern scholars debate whether the changes represented cultural adaptation that helped Egypt survive changing circumstances and remain relevant in the evolving Mediterranean world, or cultural destruction that eliminated valuable human achievements that took millennia to develop and might never be recovered or replicated by other civilizations facing similar challenges to traditional practices and indigenous cultural innovations. In the centuries following Roman conquest and the gradual establishment of foreign administrative systems, Egyptian sexuality evolved into something that retained ancient DNA while adapting to new religious and cultural pressures that would reshape the Mediterranean world and influence human sexual attitudes for millennia to come. The rise of Christianity brought moral frameworks that explicitly rejected Egyptian approaches to sexuality as pagan corruption that threatened spiritual salvation and social order. But the transformation wasn't immediate, complete, or universally accepted. Egyptian traditions proved remarkably resilient even under sustained pressure from foreign religious and legal systems that demanded conformity to different moral standards and social arrangements. New challenges emerged from Christian theology that portrayed sexuality as fundamentally problematic rather than divinely creative, viewing physical pleasure as distraction from spiritual development rather than participation in cosmic creative forces that sustained universal order and individual spiritual growth. Early Christian communities in Egypt, particularly among Coptic populations, developed ascetic traditions that celebrated celibacy and sexual restraint as spiritual achievements that demonstrated divine favor and moral superiority, directly contradicting millennia of Egyptian religious practice that had integrated sexuality into spiritual development as essential and an optional aspect of human experience. The establishment of Christian monasticism in Egyptian deserts created alternative models of spiritual life that explicitly rejected sexual relationships as obstacles to divine communion rather than pathways to spiritual understanding, attracting people who found traditional Egyptian sexual attitudes unsatisfying or spiritually inadequate, while providing religious justification for sexual restriction that had never existed in traditional Egyptian theology and practice. Christian monasteries became centers of learning and cultural influence that promoted ascetic ideals throughout Egyptian society, creating social pressure for sexual restraint and gender separation that gradually modified traditional Egyptian attitudes towards sexuality, marriage, and family relationships in ways that reduce Section 7. Later developments and evolution 1900 words. In the centuries following Roman conquest, Egyptian sexuality evolved into something that retained ancient DNA while adapting to new religious and cultural pressures that would reshape the Mediterranean world. The rise of Christianity brought moral frameworks that explicitly rejected Egyptian approaches to sexuality as pagan corruption. But the transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Egyptian traditions proved remarkably resilient even under sustained pressure from foreign religious and legal systems. New challenges emerged from Christian theology that portrayed sexuality as fundamentally problematic rather than divinely creative. Early Christian communities in Egypt, particularly among Coptic populations, developed ascetic traditions that celebrated celibacy and sexual restraint as spiritual achievements, directly contradicting millennia of Egyptian religious practice that had integrated sexuality into spiritual development. The establishment of Christian monasticism in Egyptian deserts created alternative models of spiritual life that explicitly rejected sexual relationships as obstacles to divine communion. Evolution of the situation and Egyptian adaptation to changing circumstances rather than simple capitulation to foreign pressure. Christian Egypt developed distinctive practices that incorporated some traditional Egyptian attitudes while adapting to new theological requirements. Coptic marriage ceremonies included elements of mutual consent and partnership that reflected ancient Egyptian egalitarian traditions, even as they adopted Christian language about wifely submission and male authority. Second-generation effects included the transformation of Alexandria from a cosmopolitan center of sexual learning into a major Christian theological center where debates about celibacy, marriage, and sexual morality influenced the entire Christian world. Egyptian monasticism became a model for Christian communities throughout the Mediterranean, carrying modified versions of Egyptian asceticism to societies that had never experienced Egyptian sexual liberalism. The Islamic conquest of Egypt in 641 CE introduced yet another set of religious and legal frameworks that further modified Egyptian approaches to sexuality and gender relationships. Islamic law brought its own complex attitudes towards sexuality that differed from both traditional Egyptian practices and Christian asceticism, creating new syntheses that would influence Egyptian culture for the next millennium. Their roles varied, depending on how individual Muslim rulers and religious authorities approached the challenge of governing populations with deeply rooted cultural traditions that differed from Islamic norms. Some early Islamic administrators in Egypt adopted pragmatic approaches that preserved local customs when they didn't directly contradict Islamic law, while others promoted more aggressive Islamization that sought to eliminate pre-Islamic practices completely. How they differed from earlier players becomes clear when you examine Islamic legal documents from medieval Egypt that show sophisticated attempts to reconcile Islamic family law with Egyptian traditions of female property ownership and business independence. Islamic authorities couldn't simply ignore centuries of Egyptian legal precedents without creating economic and social chaos, so they developed hybrid systems that maintained some women's rights while incorporating Islamic frameworks for marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Their contributions included the preservation and transmission of ancient Egyptian medical knowledge about sexuality and reproduction through Arabic translations and commentaries that carried Egyptian innovations throughout the Islamic world. Medieval Islamic scholars in Egypt maintained libraries and scriptoriums where ancient Egyptian texts on contraception, sexual health, and reproductive medicine were copied, translated, and adapted for contemporary use. Specific stories about these new elements include the remarkable career of Ibn al-Jawzar, a 10th century physician working in Cairo, who combined ancient Egyptian medical knowledge with Islamic ethical frameworks to create comprehensive guides to sexual health that influenced medical practice throughout the medieval Islamic world. His works show how Egyptian sexual knowledge continued to evolve and influence other cultures even centuries after the original civilization had been conquered and converted. Their disruptions included the gradual elimination of public celebrations of sexuality that had been central to ancient Egyptian religious practice. Islamic authorities prohibited festivals and ceremonies that included explicit sexual imagery or celebration of fertility deities, replacing them with religious observances that emphasized spiritual rather than physical aspects of human nature. But some problems persisted despite centuries of religious and cultural change. Egyptian attitudes toward gender relationships and sexual equality proved remarkably resistant to complete transformation, creating ongoing tensions between official, religious and legal frameworks and actual social practices that continued to reflect ancient Egyptian influences. Continuing challenges included the practical impossibility of completely eliminating women's economic independence in a society where agricultural and commercial activities had depended on female participation for millennia. Medieval Islamic Egypt continued to show higher levels of female business ownership and property control than other Islamic societies, suggesting that ancient Egyptian traditions maintained underground influence even under officially patriarchal systems. What didn't get resolved were fundamental conflicts between Egyptian cultural values that emphasized gender partnership and cooperation versus foreign religious and legal systems that promoted male authority and female subordination. These tensions created ongoing social contradictions that influenced Egyptian culture throughout the medieval and early modern periods. New versions of old problems emerged as Egyptian women found ways to maintain autonomy and independence within Islamic legal frameworks through creative use of religious law, family alliances, and economic strategies that preserve some traditional freedoms while adapting to new restrictions. Medieval Egyptian legal documents show women using Islamic marriage contracts to negotiate rights and protections that resembled ancient Egyptian arrangements, demonstrating cultural continuity even under changed circumstances. Cyclical patterns appeared as different rulers and religious authorities alternated between tolerating Egyptian traditions and attempting to eliminate them completely. Periods of cultural tolerance allowed ancient practices to resurface, while periods of religious orthodoxy drove them underground without completely destroying them. Why certain issues proved intractable relates to the deep integration of gender, equality and sexual attitudes into Egyptian economic and social systems that made complete cultural transformation practically impossible without destroying the foundations of Egyptian society. Foreign rulers discovered that maintaining Egyptian prosperity required preserving at least some Egyptian social practices, creating compromises that allow traditional attitudes to persist in modified forms. Compared to earlier periods of Egyptian history, the medieval and early modern periods showed remarkable cultural resilience despite sustained pressure from foreign religious and political systems. While ancient Egyptian sexual liberalism was significantly modified, it wasn't completely eliminated, suggesting cultural traditions that were stronger and more deeply rooted than their foreign critics understood. Compared to other places in the Islamic world, Egypt continued to show distinctive patterns of gender relationships and sexual attitudes that reflected ancient influences. Medieval travelers' accounts describe Egyptian women as more independent and assertive than women in other Islamic societies, Egyptian marriage practices as more egalitarian than Islamic norms typically allowed, and Egyptian attitudes toward sexuality as more open and naturalistic than prevailed elsewhere in the medieval Islamic world. Compared to modern times, medieval Egyptian adaptations to foreign cultural pressure offer insights into how traditional societies can maintain core values while adapting to changed circumstances. The Egyptian example suggests that cultural transformation is never complete or irreversible, that traditional practices can survive underground and resurface when circumstances change, and that cultural identity can persist through centuries of foreign rule and religious conversion. What was unique about the Egyptian experience was the extraordinary length of time that traditional attitudes influenced social practices, despite official efforts to eliminate them. Most ancient cultures that were conquered and converted to foreign religions lost their distinctive characteristics within a few generations, but Egyptian influences on gender relationships and sexuality persisted for over a millennium after the Islamic conquest. What was universal in the Egyptian experience was the tendency for traditional cultures to adapt to foreign pressure through compromise and synthesis rather than complete transformation or total resistance. The Egyptian example shows patterns of cultural change that appear in other societies facing similar challenges from foreign conquest and religious conversion. Lessons that could be learned include the importance of economic factors in cultural preservation, the resilience of social practices that are deeply integrated into daily life, and the possibility of maintaining cultural identity even under sustained foreign pressure. The Egyptian example also demonstrates how cultural transformation is always incomplete and reversible, offering hope for societies that have lost traditional practices but might be able to recover them under different circumstances. Patterns that repeated elsewhere include the tendency for traditional gender relationships to prove more resistant to change than other cultural practices, the importance of religious and legal frameworks in shaping sexual attitudes, and the role of economic necessity in preserving traditional social arrangements, even when they conflict with official ideology. The Egyptian pattern of cultural adaptation and resistance influenced other Islamic societies and provided models for how traditional cultures could maintain identity while adapting to foreign rule. By the 16th century, signs pointed to the final transformation of Egyptian sexual culture as Ottoman Turkish rule brought new administrative systems that prioritized imperial efficiency over local customs, and European colonial influence introduced Victorian moral codes that would complete what centuries of foreign conquest had begun in systematically eliminating indigenous practices that conflicted with foreign expectations about proper social organization and moral behavior. The warning signs were subtle, but unmistakable to those who understood Egyptian cultural history. Traditional Egyptian festivals disappearing from official calendars and community celebrations, women's business activities becoming increasingly restricted through bureaucratic regulations that required male oversight and approval, and Islamic religious authorities gaining increased power to enforce conservative interpretations of sexual morality that had little precedent in earlier Egyptian Islamic practice or traditional indigenous customs. Ottoman administrative reforms introduced bureaucratic procedures that favored male authority and reduced women's legal agency in ways that systematically undermined traditional Egyptian practices without explicitly targeting them as cultural threats. The reforms were presented as modernization and administrative efficiency rather than cultural suppression, making resistance seem backward and anti-progressive rather than legitimate defense of valuable cultural traditions and practical social arrangements that had served Egyptian society effectively for millennia. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals interesting patterns of cultural blindness and adaptation that characterize this period of transition and decline. Ottoman administrators recognized that Egyptian agricultural productivity depended on women's economic participation, so they maintained some legal protections for female property ownership and business activities, while restricting other aspects of women's independence that seemed politically threatening or socially disruptive according to Ottoman standards of proper social organization. European missionaries and travelers who began arriving in larger numbers during this period completely misunderstood what they were witnessing, interpreting Egyptian women's remaining freedoms as signs of Islamic decadence and moral corruption, rather than recognizing them as remnants of ancient Egyptian traditions that had survived centuries of foreign rule through cultural adaptation and creative resistance that preserved essential elements while modifying surface characteristics. Egyptian religious and intellectual leaders found themselves caught between competing pressures that made effective cultural preservation increasingly difficult and politically dangerous. They needed to maintain traditional practices that defined Egyptian cultural identity and provided social stability, while adapting to Ottoman administrative requirements that demanded conformity to imperial standards and emerging European influence that increasingly portrayed Egyptian sexuality and gender relationships as primitive and backwards evidence of civilizational inferiority. Some Egyptian scholars began writing defensive treatises explaining Egyptian practices in terms that would be acceptable to foreign critics, attempting to justify traditional customs through Islamic theology and Ottoman law rather than asserting their value as indigenous cultural achievements that deserved preservation and respect regardless of foreign approval or disapproval. Others retreated into religious orthodoxy that rejected traditional Egyptian attitudes as un-Islamic innovations that should be eliminated in favor of strict conformity to conservative Islamic interpretation that aligned with Ottoman political preferences, and European missionary expectations about proper religious and moral behavior. Resistance to inevitable change came primarily from rural communities and traditional craft guilds, where ancient Egyptian practices remained most deeply embedded in daily life, economic activity, and social organization that made dramatic cultural transformation practically difficult and economically disruptive. Archaeological evidence from 18th century Egyptian villages shows continued celebration of fertility festivals, maintenance of traditional marriage practices, and preservation of folk medicine traditions that incorporated ancient Egyptian knowledge about sexuality and reproduction. Rural resistance wasn't organized political opposition, but rather cultural conservatism and practical necessity that made traditional practices economically and socially useful regardless of official approval or foreign criticism. Farm families continued to organize work and family relationships according to traditional patterns that maximized economic efficiency and social stability, even when these patterns conflicted with official religious doctrine or administrative preference. How the era of Egyptian sexual distinctiveness finally ended was through a combination of European colonial administration and modernization programs that systematically eliminated traditional practices in favor of Victorian moral codes and European legal frameworks that define civilization and progress in terms of conformity to European standards rather than preservation of indigenous cultural achievements or adaptation of traditional practices to contemporary circumstances. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 marked the beginning of sustained European intervention that would eventually transform Egypt from a society with distinctive sexual attitudes and gender relationships into a province subject to European moral and legal standards that prioritized male authority, female subordination, and sexual restriction as evidence of moral development and civilizational advancement rather than cultural oppression and human potential limitation. The invasion itself was brief and militarily unsuccessful, but it established precedents for European involvement in Egyptian affairs and introduced European ideas about proper social organization that would influence Egyptian modernization efforts throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, creating cultural frameworks that portray traditional Egyptian practices as obstacles to progress rather than valuable cultural achievements worthy of preservation and development. Specific events that marked the end included Muhammad Ali's 19th century modernization programs that replaced traditional Egyptian legal systems with European-inspired codes that systematically eliminated women's traditional rights and established male guardianship requirements that had never existed under traditional Egyptian law. The reforms were presented as necessary modernization that would allow Egypt to compete with European powers, but they effectively destroyed legal frameworks that had protected gender equality and individual autonomy for millennia. The establishment of European-style schools that taught Victorian moral values rather than traditional Egyptian approaches to sexuality and gender relationships created new generations of Egyptians who were educated to view their own cultural heritage as backwards and embarrassing rather than sophisticated and valuable, undermining cultural continuity and creating internal pressure for abandoning traditional practices in favor of foreign customs. The gradual elimination of traditional festivals and celebrations that had maintained ancient Egyptian sexual culture for over 4 millennia, replaced by religious observances and cultural activities that emphasized European concepts of propriety, morality, and social organization rather than indigenous traditions of celebration, community participation, and cultural expression. Final major players included Muhammad Ali himself, whose attempts to modernize Egypt according to European models required eliminating traditional practices that Europeans considered backward and immoral evidence of civilizational inferiority. European advisors and administrators who designed new legal and educational systems explicitly sought to transform Egyptian sexual attitudes and gender relationships to match European standards of morality and social organization. Islamic modernist reformers like Muhammad Abduh attempted to create synthesis between Islamic principles and European practices, but their compromises generally favored European approaches over traditional Egyptian ones, contributing to cultural transformation rather than indigenous preservation and adaptation that might have maintained Egyptian distinctiveness within modern frameworks. European colonial administrators who gained increasing control over Egyptian affairs during the late 19th and early 20th centuries implemented systematic policies designed to eliminate traditional practices and establish European cultural hegemony that would make Egypt safe for European investment and politically reliable for European strategic interests. Last attempts to preserve traditional Egyptian sexuality from folkloric preservation movements and traditional religious authorities who recognized that fundamental aspects of Egyptian cultural identity were being lost and attempted to document, defend, and maintain practices that had defined Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. Some Egyptian intellectuals attempted to document traditional practices and argue for their historical and cultural value, demonstrating their sophistication and social benefits in ways that challenged European assumptions about primitive sexuality and backward gender relationships. Religious conservatives tried to maintain traditional Islamic interpretations that had accommodated Egyptian practices, arguing against modernist reforms that favored European customs over indigenous traditions that had been successfully integrated into Islamic frameworks through centuries of cultural adaptation and religious synthesis. But these preservation efforts were generally overwhelmed by the political and economic pressures for modernization according to European standards that had become synonymous with progress, civilization, and international respectability in ways that made traditional practices seem like obstacles to advancement rather than valuable cultural resources that deserved preservation and development. The dramatic final moments occurred during the British colonial period, when traditional Egyptian legal systems were completely replaced by British legal codes that eliminated women's traditional property rights, imposed European marriage and divorce laws, and established moral standards that criminalized many traditional Egyptian sexual practices as evidence of moral corruption and social disorder that threatened public order and civilized behavior. The symbolic endpoints included the last traditional fertility festivals being banned as public health hazards and threats to public morality, the final traditional women's guilds being dissolved as inconsistent with modern economic organization and proper gender relationships, and the elimination of traditional medical practices that had preserved ancient Egyptian knowledge about sexuality and reproduction for over 4 millennia. What made these changes irreversible was the integration of Egypt into global economic and political systems that required conformity to European standards as the price of international acceptance and economic development, creating practical pressures that made traditional practices seem economically disadvantageous and politically dangerous rather than culturally valuable and socially beneficial. Unlike previous foreign conquests that had allowed Egyptians to maintain traditional practices in exchange for political submission and economic cooperation, European colonialism demanded cultural transformation as evidence of civilization and progress that was necessary for international recognition and economic integration into global systems controlled by European powers. Analysis of causes reveals that ancient Egyptian sexual culture ended not because it was inherently unstable, unsustainable, or inadequate for human needs and social organization, but because it couldn't survive the systematic pressure from European colonial systems that possess superior military technology and economic power combined with absolute confidence in the moral superiority of their own sexual attitudes and gender relationships, that brought no compromise or accommodation with indigenous practices. The combination of military conquest, economic domination, and cultural missionary activity created unprecedented pressure for comprehensive cultural transformation that exceeded anything previous conquerors had attempted or achieved, making traditional Egyptian practices seem like obstacles to progress, rather than valuable cultural achievements that deserved preservation and adaptation to contemporary circumstances. Internal problems that made Egyptian society vulnerable to complete cultural transformation included the gradual weakening of traditional Egyptian institutions through centuries of foreign rule that had reduced their capacity to resist European cultural pressure and maintain indigenous practices against systematic efforts to eliminate them. By the 19th century, Egyptian religious and educational institutions lacked the independence and resources necessary to maintain traditional practices against systematic European efforts to eliminate them through legal prohibition, economic pressure, and cultural ridicule. Traditional Egyptian cultural institutions had been weakened by centuries of foreign rule that had gradually reduced their authority, resources, and social influence, making them unable to provide effective resistance to European cultural pressure that was more systematic and comprehensive than anything they had previously encountered from foreign conquerors who had been content with political control rather than cultural transformation. External pressures proved overwhelming when European powers combined military conquest with economic domination and cultural missionary activity that portrayed Egyptian traditional practices as evidence of backwardness and moral corruption that needed to be eliminated for Egypt's own good and for the benefit of civilized international order that required conformity to European standards. European control of education, law, and economic development created systematic pressure for cultural transformation that exceeded anything previous conquerors had attempted, making traditional practices seem economically disadvantageous and politically dangerous rather than culturally valuable and socially beneficial for individual and collective welfare. The role of individuals versus historical forces shows how cultural destruction requires both systematic institutional pressure and individual choices by people who abandon traditional practices in pursuit of opportunities available through adopting foreign customs that provide access to education, employment, and social advancement within new political and economic systems controlled by foreign powers. Egyptian sexual culture ended because millions of individual Egyptians found that maintaining traditional practices carried increasing costs, while adopting European practices offered access to education, employment, and social advancement that weren't available through traditional cultural participation, creating individual incentives for cultural abandonment that collectively resulted in cultural destruction. What could have been done differently depends on whether you focus on Egyptian choices or broader historical circumstances that created the context for cultural transformation. Some Egyptian intellectuals argued for selective modernization that would adopt European technology and administrative methods while maintaining traditional cultural practices, But these compromise approaches proved politically impossible under colonial conditions that demanded comprehensive cultural transformation. As evidence of civilization and progress, Egyptian resistance to cultural transformation was handicapped by a lack of political independence, economic resources, and international support that would have been necessary to maintain traditional practices against systematic European pressure, making cultural preservation seem impossible and cultural adaptation seem like the only viable survival strategy. The question of inevitability versus contingency reveals how cultural destruction often results from specific historical circumstances rather than inherent characteristics of the cultures involved or universal patterns of historical development. Egyptian sexual culture might have survived and evolved if Egypt had remained politically independent, if European colonialism had been less systematically focused on cultural transformation, or if global economic development had followed different patterns that didn't require conformity to European standards for international acceptance and economic integration. The immediate aftermath of Egyptian sexual culture's destruction was the emergence of modern Egyptian society that combined European legal and moral frameworks with residual elements of traditional practices that created new hybrid arrangements, rather than complete European replication or total elimination of indigenous influences, demonstrating how cultural transformation is always incomplete and contested rather than total and definitive. Egyptian women lost most traditional rights and freedoms, but retained some legal protections and social expectations that exceeded what was typical in contemporary European societies, suggesting that complete cultural transformation was impossible, even under systematic colonial pressure, and that indigenous traditions maintained underground influence even when official policies favored foreign practices and values. Who stepped into the vacuum were primarily European-educated Egyptian professionals and religious reformers who attempted to create a modern Egyptian identity that would be acceptable to European standards while maintaining some connection to Egyptian historical traditions that could provide cultural continuity and national pride without threatening European interests or challenging colonial authority and administrative control. These new leaders generally accepted European judgments about traditional Egyptian sexuality, while arguing that reformed Islamic practices could provide acceptable alternatives to complete European cultural adoption that would eliminate all traces of indigenous identity and cultural distinctiveness. They sought middle ground that would satisfy European requirements while preserving some sense of Egyptian cultural identity. But their compromises generally favored European approaches over traditional Egyptian ones. The new Egyptian elite consisted largely of people who had been educated in European schools, trained in European legal and administrative systems, and socialized to view European culture as superior to indigenous traditions that needed to be abandoned or fundamentally modified to meet standards of modern civilization and international respectability. Short-term consequences included significant disruption to Egyptian family life and gender relationships, as legal and social changes eliminated traditional support systems without providing adequate replacements or alternative arrangements that could maintain family stability and individual welfare during the transition to new social and economic systems. Women who had depended on traditional property rights and business opportunities found themselves economically vulnerable under new legal systems that required male guardianship, restricted female economic participation in ways that created financial dependence and social subordination that hadn't existed under traditional Egyptian arrangements or even under earlier foreign rule that had maintained some accommodation with indigenous practices. Traditional family structures that had balanced individual autonomy with collective responsibility were disrupted by new legal frameworks that imposed European concepts of male authority and female subordination, creating conflicts between official requirements and practical family needs that made daily life more difficult and less satisfying for many Egyptian families. Economic disruption occurred when women's traditional business activities and professional services were restricted or eliminated, reducing family income and economic opportunities, while increasing dependence on male relatives who might not have the skills, knowledge, or social connections that women had previously contributed to family economic strategies and social advancement. Contemporary reactions varied depending on social class, education level, and exposure to European culture, creating divisions within Egyptian society between those who welcomed the changes as necessary modernization and those who experienced them as cultural destruction and personal loss that eliminated valuable practices and social arrangements. European educated Egyptians generally welcomed the changes as necessary modernization that would allow Egypt to join the community of civilized nations and gain international respect and recognition that had been denied under traditional social arrangements that Europeans viewed as backwards and morally corrupt evidence of civilizational inferiority. These modernized Egyptians often became advocates for a further cultural transformation and critics of traditional practices that they viewed as obstacles to progress and international acceptance, creating internal pressure for cultural change that complemented external colonial pressure and made resistance to cultural transformation seem backwards and unpatriotic. Traditional Egyptians often experienced the changes as cultural destruction that eliminated valuable practices and knowledge that had served Egyptian society for millennia, creating social arrangements that were less satisfying and less effective than traditional practices, while providing few compensating benefits for ordinary people who lost traditional rights and opportunities. Rural and working-class Egyptians were particularly affected by the elimination of traditional economic opportunities and legal protections that had provided security and autonomy under traditional arrangements, making them more vulnerable to economic exploitation and social subordination under new systems that favored educated elites and foreign interests. Attempts at revival or continuation included folkloric movements that sought to preserve traditional Egyptian practices as cultural heritage rather than living traditions that could be maintained and developed within contemporary social and economic contexts. These preservation efforts treated traditional practices as historical curiosities rather than viable alternatives to European cultural models. Islamic reform movements attempted to recover traditional Islamic approaches to sexuality and gender relationships that had been modified or abandoned during the colonial period, arguing that authentic Islamic practices were superior to both traditional Egyptian customs and European cultural imports. But these efforts generally favored conservative Islamic interpretation over indigenous Egyptian traditions. Nationalist movements portrayed traditional Egyptian practices as authentic cultural identity that should be preserved against foreign influence. But their efforts to revive traditional practices were generally symbolic rather than practical, focusing on cultural symbols and historical references rather than actual restoration of traditional legal, economic, and social arrangements that had supported Egyptian sexual culture. However, these revival efforts generally failed to restore traditional practices to their former central role in Egyptian social life, partly because the economic and political conditions that had supported traditional arrangements no longer existed, and partly because new generations of Egyptians had been educated to view traditional practices as backwards and inappropriate for modern civilized society. The revival movements also faced opposition from modernized Egyptian elites who viewed attempts to restore traditional practices as threats to Egypt's international reputation and progress toward European standards of civilization that they believed were necessary for political independence and economic development. Most importantly, the structural changes in Egyptian society, new legal systems, educational institutions, economic arrangements, and political organization made traditional practices practically difficult or impossible to maintain even for people who valued them and wanted to preserve them as part of Egyptian cultural identity and social organization. By the 16th century, signs pointed to the final transformation of Egyptian sexual culture as Ottoman Turkish rule brought new administrative systems, and European colonial influence introduced Victorian moral codes that would complete what centuries of foreign conquest had begun. The warning signs were subtle but unmistakable. Traditional Egyptian festivals disappearing from official calendars, women's business activities becoming increasingly restricted through bureaucratic regulations, and Islamic religious authorities gaining increased power to enforce conservative interpretations of sexual morality that had little precedent in earlier Egyptian Islamic practice. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals interesting patterns of cultural blindness and adaptation. Ottoman administrators recognized that Egyptian agricultural productivity depended on women's economic participation, so they maintained some legal protections for female property ownership while restricting other aspects of women's independence. European missionaries and travelers who began arriving in larger numbers during this period completely misunderstood what they were witnessing, interpreting Egyptian women's remaining freedoms as signs of Islamic decadence, rather than recognizing them as remnants of ancient Egyptian traditions. Egyptian religious and intellectual leaders found themselves caught between competing pressures, maintaining traditional practices that had Egyptian cultural identity, while adapting to Ottoman administrative requirements and emerging European influence that increasingly portrayed Egyptian sexuality as primitive and backwards. Some Egyptian scholars began writing defensive treatises explaining Egyptian practices in terms that would be acceptable to foreign critics, while others retreated into religious orthodoxy that rejected traditional Egyptian attitudes as un-Islamic innovations. Resistance to inevitable change came primarily from rural communities and traditional craft guilds, where ancient Egyptian practices remained most deeply embedded in daily life. Archaeological evidence from 18th century Egyptian villages shows continued celebration of fertility festivals, maintenance of traditional marriage practices, and preservation of folk medicine traditions that incorporated ancient Egyptian knowledge about sexuality and reproduction. How the era of Egyptian sexual distinctiveness finally ended was through a combination of European colonial administration and modernization programs that systematically eliminated traditional practices in favor of Victorian moral codes and European legal frameworks. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 marked the beginning of sustained European intervention that would eventually transform Egypt from a society with distinctive sexual attitudes into a province subject to European moral and legal standards. Specific events that marked the end included Muhammad Ali's 19th century modernization programs that replaced traditional Egyptian legal systems with European-inspired codes, the establishment of European-style schools that taught Victorian moral values rather than traditional Egyptian approaches to sexuality and gender relationships, and the gradual elimination of traditional festivals and celebrations that had maintained ancient Egyptian sexual culture for over 4 millennia. Final major players included Muhammad Ali himself, whose attempts to modernize Egypt according to European models required eliminating traditional practices that Europeans considered backward and immoral. European advisors and administrators who designed new legal and educational systems explicitly sought to transform Egyptian sexual attitudes and gender relationships to match European standards. Islamic modernist reformers like Muhammad Abduh attempted to create synthesis between Islamic principles and European practices, but their compromises generally favored European approaches over traditional Egyptian ones. Last attempts to preserve traditional Egyptian sexuality came from folkloric preservation movements and traditional religious authorities who recognized that fundamental aspects of Egyptian cultural identity were being lost. Some Egyptian intellectuals attempted to document traditional practices and argue for their historical and cultural value, but these efforts were generally overwhelmed by the political and economic pressures for modernization according to European standards. The dramatic final moments occurred during the British colonial period, when traditional Egyptian legal systems were completely replaced by British legal codes that eliminated women's traditional property rights, imposed European marriage and divorce laws, and established moral standards that criminalized many traditional Egyptian sexual practices. The symbolic endpoints included the last traditional fertility festivals being banned as public health hazards, and the final traditional women's guilds being dissolved as inconsistent with modern economic organization. What made these changes irreversible was the integration of Egypt into global economic and political systems that required conformity to European standards as the price of international acceptance and economic development. Unlike previous foreign conquests that had allowed Egyptians to maintain traditional practices in exchange for political submission, European colonialism demanded cultural transformation as evidence of civilization and progress. Analysis of causes reveals that ancient Egyptian sexual culture ended not because it was inherently unstable or unsustainable, but because it couldn't survive the systematic pressure from European colonial systems that possess superior military technology and economic power combined with absolute confidence in the moral superiority of their own sexual attitudes and gender relationships. Internal problems included the gradual weakening of traditional Egyptian institutions through centuries of foreign rule that had reduced their capacity to resist European cultural pressure. By the 19th century, Egyptian religious and educational institutions lacked the independence and resources necessary to maintain traditional practices against systematic European efforts to eliminate them. External pressures proved overwhelming. When European powers combined military conquest with economic domination and cultural missionary activity that portrayed Egyptian traditional practices as evidence of backwardness and moral corruption that needed to be eliminated for Egypt's own good, European control of education, law, and economic development created systematic pressure for cultural transformation that exceeded anything previous conquerors had attempted. The role of individuals versus historical forces shows how cultural destruction requires both systematic institutional pressure and individual choices by people who abandon traditional practices in pursuit of opportunities available through adopting foreign customs. Egyptian sexual culture ended because millions of individual Egyptians found that maintaining traditional practices carried increasing costs, while adopting European practices offered access to education, employment, and social advancement. What could have been done differently depends on whether you focus on Egyptian choices or broader historical circumstances. Some Egyptian intellectuals argued for selective modernization that would adopt European technology and administrative methods while maintaining traditional cultural practices. But these compromise approaches proved politically impossible under colonial conditions that demanded comprehensive cultural transformation. The question of inevitability versus contingency reveals how cultural destruction often results from specific historical circumstances rather than inherent characteristics of the cultures involved. Egyptian sexual culture might have survived and evolved if Egypt had remained politically independent, if European colonialism had been less systematically focused on cultural transformation, or if global economic development had followed different patterns that didn't require conformity to European standards. The immediate aftermath of Egyptian sexual culture's destruction was the emergence of modern Egyptian society that combined European legal and moral frameworks with residual elements of traditional practices that created new hybrid arrangements rather than complete European replication. Egyptian women lost most traditional rights and freedoms, but retained some legal protections and social expectations that exceeded what was typical in contemporary European societies, who stepped into the vacuum were primarily European educated Egyptian professionals and religious reformers who attempted to create modern Egyptian identity that would be acceptable to European standards while maintaining some connection to Egyptian historical traditions. These new leaders generally accepted European judgments about traditional Egyptian sexuality, while arguing that reformed Islamic practices could provide acceptable alternatives to complete European cultural adoption. Short-term consequences included significant disruption to Egyptian family life and gender relationships, as legal and social changes eliminated traditional support systems without providing adequate replacements. Women who had depended on traditional property rights and business opportunities found themselves economically vulnerable under new legal systems that required male guardianship, restricted female economic participation. Contemporary reactions varied depending on social class and education level. European educated Egyptians generally welcomed the changes as necessary modernization that would allow Egypt to join the community of civilized nations, while traditional Egyptians often experienced the changes as cultural destruction that eliminated valuable practices and knowledge that had served Egyptian society for millennia. Attempts at revival or continuation included folkloric movements that sought to preserve traditional Egyptian practices as cultural heritage rather than living traditions. Islamic reform movements that attempted to recover traditional Islamic approaches to sexuality and gender relationships, and nationalist movements that portrayed traditional Egyptian practices as authentic cultural identity that should be preserved against foreign influence. However, these revival efforts generally failed to restore traditional practices to their former central role in Egyptian social life. The legacy of ancient Egyptian sexuality, later developments in ways that most people don't realize, creating underground influences that persisted through centuries of cultural suppression and eventually contributed to modern movements for sexual equality and individual freedom. Egyptian medical knowledge about contraception and sexual health was preserved through Islamic translations that influenced medieval European medicine, Renaissance sexual understanding, and eventually modern reproductive science in ways that medical historians are still discovering. Specific influences appear in unexpected places throughout Western intellectual history. Medieval European courtly love traditions incorporated elements of Egyptian love poetry that had been transmitted through Arabic sources, creating literary conventions that celebrated romantic love and female agency in ways that contradicted contemporary Christian teachings about sexuality and gender relationships. Renaissance humanists who rediscovered ancient Egyptian texts found alternatives to Christian sexual morality that influenced Enlightenment thinking about natural law and individual rights. How later generations viewed Egyptian sexuality reveals patterns of cultural amnesia and recovery that continue to influence contemporary debates. Victorian scholars who first systematically studied ancient Egypt were so shocked by Egyptian sexual attitudes that they literally hid evidence and misrepresented findings to avoid challenging Christian moral assumptions. This created scholarly traditions that portrayed ancient Egypt as either sexually repressed like other ancient civilizations, or as sexually decadent in ways that justified European colonial intervention. Myths versus realities that developed include persistent misconceptions about ancient Egyptian sexuality that continue to influence popular understanding. Hollywood depictions of Egypt as exotic and sexually dangerous reflect Victorian anxieties rather than ancient Egyptian realities, while New Age spiritual movements that celebrate Egyptian sexuality often romanticize ancient practices without understanding their cultural contexts or practical implications. Why Egyptian sexual traditions remained important or were forgotten depends largely on how they served contemporary political and cultural agendas. During periods when gender equality and sexual freedom were politically popular, Egyptian examples were cited as historical precedents for progressive sexual attitudes. During conservative periods, Egyptian sexuality was either ignored completely or portrayed as evidence of pagan corruption that justified restrictive moral codes. Today, we can see echoes of ancient Egyptian sexuality in contemporary movements for gender equality, reproductive rights, and sexual freedom that often unknowingly replicate arguments and practices that Egyptians developed 3 millennia ago. Modern feminists advocating for women's economic independence, legal equality, and sexual autonomy are essentially arguing for rights that Egyptian women took for granted throughout most of their civilization's history. Specific parallels include contemporary debates about contraception access that mirror ancient Egyptian medical practices, where women controlled their own reproductive health through sophisticated knowledge of birth control methods. Modern discussions about marriage equality and divorce rights reflect Egyptian legal frameworks that treated both partners as equal participants in relationships that could be ended by either party without stigma or financial penalty. What hasn't changed about human nature appears clearly when you compare ancient Egyptian love poetry with contemporary popular music, modern dating apps with Egyptian courtship practices, or current sexual health education with ancient Egyptian medical texts. The fundamental human desires for love, pleasure, companionship, and reproductive control remain constant across cultures and centuries, suggesting that Egyptian approaches to sexuality succeeded because they addressed universal human needs rather than culture-specific requirements. Similar patterns in different contexts emerge when you examine how other societies have independently developed practices resembling ancient Egyptian sexuality. Some contemporary Scandinavian societies have achieved levels of gender equality and sexual freedom that approach Egyptian standards, while various indigenous cultures maintain traditions of female autonomy and sexual openness that parallel Egyptian practices until colonial disruption eliminated them. Lessons for contemporary issues include Egyptian demonstrations that gender equality and sexual freedom can coexist with social stability, economic prosperity, and cultural continuity in ways that challenge modern assumptions about necessary trade-offs between individual liberty and collective order. Egyptian evidence suggests that societies benefit rather than suffer when women enjoy economic independence and sexual autonomy, when both partners contribute equally to family prosperity, and when sexuality is celebrated as natural pleasure rather than shameful necessity. The Egyptian example also offers warnings about how quickly progressive sexual attitudes can be lost when societies face external pressure from less tolerant cultures, economic disruption that makes traditional practices impractical, or religious movements that portray sexuality as spiritual obstacle other than divine gift. Egyptian sexual culture survived for 3 millennia, but disappeared within a few generations once systematic pressure was applied by colonial powers with different values and superior military technology. Modern parallel societies that have achieved gender equality and sexual freedom often struggle to maintain these achievements against conservative political movements, religious fundamentalism, and economic pressures that make traditional gender roles seem more practical than egalitarian. Partnerships. The Egyptian experience suggests both the possibility and fragility of sexual progressiveness in human societies. Even now, ancient Egyptian sexuality influences modern areas in ways that most people don't recognize, but that continue to shape contemporary culture, law, medicine, and social relationships. Academic study of ancient sexuality has revolutionized scholarly understanding of gender relationships, family structures, and social organization in ways that influence everything from anthropological research to policy recommendations for international development programs. Popular culture continues to draw on Egyptian sexual imagery and themes, though often in distorted ways that reflect contemporary anxieties rather than ancient realities. Movies, television, literature, and visual arts frequently use Egyptian settings and characters to explore sexual themes that would be controversial in contemporary contexts, creating modern myths that both preserve and misrepresent ancient Egyptian attitudes. Political discourse increasingly references ancient Egyptian examples of gender equality and sexual freedom, historical precedents for contemporary progressive movements, though political activists often lack detailed knowledge of how Egyptian practices actually functioned or what conditions made them sustainable. Both feminist and conservative political movements cite Egyptian evidence selectively to support their positions, demonstrating the continuing relevance of ancient sexuality to modern political debates. Social movements for reproductive rights, gender equality, and sexual freedom often unknowingly replicate Egyptian arguments and practices, suggesting either universal human intuitions about proper sexual relationships or direct cultural transmission through historical influences that researchers haven't fully traced. Modern contraception advocacy, marriage equality movements, and campaigns for economic gender equality all echo ancient Egyptian positions and practices. Why people still care about ancient Egyptian sexuality reflects both scholarly interest in understanding human sexual diversity and contemporary political needs for historical examples of successful sexual progressiveness. Egyptian civilization provides the longest and most successful example of gender-equal, sexually liberated society in human history, making it valuable evidence for both academic research and political advocacy. The continuing influence also reflects modern recognition that contemporary sexual attitudes and gender relationships aren't natural or inevitable, but represent specific cultural choices that can be changed through appropriate legal, economic, and social reforms. Egyptian evidence demonstrates that alternative approaches to sexuality and gender are not only possible, but can be highly successful, offering hope for contemporary societies struggling with sexual inequality and gender discrimination that seem intractable but may actually be easily changed with appropriate institutional support. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've discussed about Egyptian sexuality and its broader significance for understanding human possibilities. In 1922, when Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb and discovered the most intact royal burial in Egyptian history, he found something that Victorian sensibilities forced him to hide from public view for decades: a collection of the young pharaoh's personal items that included contraceptive devices, erotic artwork, and love letters between Tutankhamun and his wife Ankhesenamun. Among these intimate artifacts was a small golden amulet depicting the couple in sexual embrace, not as a fertility symbol or religious icon, but as a personal memento of their romantic and sexual relationship. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the imagery was explicit, and the emotional content was unmistakable. This was a young man who wanted to remember his wife's love and sexual pleasure as he journeyed into the afterlife. For Tutankhamun, sexuality wasn't something to transcend or escape, but something precious to preserve for eternity. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes becomes clear when you realize that Tutankhamun died at 18 or 19 years old, after a brief marriage that was probably arranged for political reasons, during a period of Egyptian history marked by religious upheaval and political instability. Yet despite these challenges, his relationship with Ankhesenamun apparently provided enough love, pleasure, and emotional fulfillment that he wanted to take reminders of their sexual and romantic connection into the afterlife. What it reveals about Egyptian sexuality is that even young people in politically arranged marriages could experience mutual love and sexual satisfaction within Egyptian cultural frameworks that celebrated sexuality as divine gift rather than necessary burden. The couple's tomb goods include matching jewelry, shared artistic themes, and complementary burial arrangements that suggest partnership and equality rather than hierarchy and submission. How it connects to everything we've discussed shows Egyptian success in creating cultural conditions where sexuality could flourish as positive life force that enhanced rather than threatened individual happiness, family stability, and social order. Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun lived during Egypt's most politically turbulent period, yet their relationship apparently provided the love, pleasure, and emotional support that Egyptian sexual culture was designed to foster. The memorable final images of a teenage pharaoh and his young wife who found enough joy in their sexual and romantic relationship that they wanted to preserve it for eternity, surrounded by a civilization that celebrated their love as participation in cosmic creative forces rather than distraction from spiritual development. Their story represents both the achievements and the tragedy of Egyptian sexual culture, remarkable human possibilities that were eventually lost to historical forces beyond individual control.